Hello ma'am, my name is Ajay Jadhav and today's date is 9 October and today I will choose of Spring Boot Starter. Spring Boot Starter is an application of a class path we can has to bin as a configure mark as a responsible to assuming that will be about has to missing up a address do has a item of a Spring Boot you have focusing for business and a less of a infrastructure that the following example show as a Spring Boot as for the we can has to the Spring MVC class path and there has to the several specific bin almost there as to the Spring Boot at automatically Spring Boot starter Spring Boot MVC Spring Boot MVC as an application has to needed to surveillance container. It is a server automatically embedded into the Jerry our class path and properly we can not to the Tomcat instance we can embedded into the JD Spring Boot and the handle of a time slips and class path we can has been to the always we can adding application to the context has to the boot and they has to the this they has to the example we can as a automatically configure Spring Boot provide that same time of a Spring Boot does not has to the very example of a example we can thanks leave our class path and it is automatically we can has to the application context define we can has to the platform engineer that will be a setting to the Spring Boot as to the live into the control as a effort into the part of a guide and provides we can example that will be sampling that as to the product of as an application or the development in Spring more we can as starter to the more classes and boot has to guide and quickly test into the Spring. Quickly test into the Spring does not has to the create of a Spring Boot based project visit of a Spring initializer till has to the project and your project has to the optional of a download as the bundle of a project does not has to the build into the simple web applications and Spring Boot applications. They has to the useful and starter advertising that Spring Boot and starter has to the allow of jars and jars in class path as a Spring Boot build and a starter make. Development is easier to the rapid and Spring Boot starter we can has to dependency describer has to the Spring Boot as the framework to the starter work from similar naming of a pattern. Spring Boot pattern as tester as to the domain that the donate that example we can has to use of Spring Data JPA as a database access to needed and that will be a Spring has to dependencies as a POM XML file and Spring project as to the fast of a build we can has to the class path. The configure of a make to responsible assuming that will be missing of adding of those as items. That is a Spring Boot as a focusing on business features as led to the infrastructure as a following of giving the example. The boot as for Spring and MVC of a class path as to the there has to the several specific bin almost we can need into the Spring Boot as the automatically MVC as a application to the also of a container as a Spring Boot as a configure is embedded into the Tomcat they has to the just we can few example of automatically configure as a Spring Boot provide at a same time and a Spring Boot does not has to the get into the very of example as a theme of a life and automatically as a that engine as a application as a defined to the that will be engine and that will be setting into the Spring Boot does not has to the add one to live as a control of that will be live into the control of a little effort into the our part. Thank you, ma'am.